What if I told you that the giants in the Bible were real? Not myths, not legends, but actual beings so powerful and dangerous that God himself decided to wipe them from the face of the earth. But here's the part that will shake you. What if they never truly disappeared? What if their influence is still at work today, hidden in plain sight, shaping the world in ways we're only beginning to understand? Ancient texts from every corner of the world speak of giants walking among us, not just tall men, but colossal beings of unimaginable strength, beings that left behind stories, ruins, and mysteries that continue to baffle scholars and theologians to this day. The Bible calls them the Nephilim, and their story is far more shocking than you've been told. This isn't just another biblical mystery, it's a warning, a message echoing through time from the days before the Great Flood to the very moment you're living in right now. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, we find a passage that has puzzled theologians for centuries. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men. But here's the real question. If the flood was meant to destroy them, why do we see evidence of their existence long after? Why do they reappear in the time of Moses? Why does David have to face a descendant of these beings in battle? And more importantly, what if their influence never truly ended? What if the same forces that brought them into the world before the flood are working right now to bring them back? Over the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal evidence that will challenge everything you thought you knew about these mysterious beings. You'll see why God found their presence so disturbing that he cleansed the entire earth. Yet somehow they returned, wreaking havoc in the times of Moses, Joshua, and even King David. We'll explore who the sons of God really were, why their actions triggered divine intervention, and how these beings managed to survive the flood when they were supposed to be wiped out. And then we'll confront the biggest question of all, why Jesus himself warned that as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man. This is more than ancient history. This is a prophetic key to understanding the spiritual battle still raging in our time. Stay with me until the end, because the final revelation will not only change how you see biblical history, it might change how you see the world around you today. The world before the flood was unlike anything we can imagine today. Scripture tells us it was a time when the boundaries between the spiritual and physical realms became dangerously thin. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 and 2 describes an extraordinary event that would change everything. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. This simple passage hides within it one of the most profound mysteries in all of Scripture. Who were these sons of God? The ancient Hebrew texts use the term Bene Elohim, a phrase that in every other instance where it appears in the Old Testament refers specifically to angelic beings. These weren't just powerful human rulers or spiritually enlightened men. These were beings from the divine realm who crossed a boundary never meant to be crossed. When these sons of God took human wives, something unprecedented occurred. Their offspring became what the Bible calls the Nephilim, mighty ones, heroes of old, men of renown. But the Hebrew word Nephilim carries darker undertones. It comes from the root word meaning to fall or to cause to fall. These weren't celebrated heroes. They were fallen ones, those who cause others to fall. Consider what this union represented. These beings weren't just extraordinarily tall or physically powerful. They were a corruption of God's created order, a mixing of the divine and human that was never meant to be. Their very existence violated the boundaries God had established between the spiritual and physical realms. The Book of Enoch, though not canonical scripture, provides additional ancient perspective on this event. It describes these beings as bringing forbidden knowledge to humanity, teaching humans everything from weaponry to cosmetics, from sorcery to astronomy. Under their influence, the pre-flood world became a place of extraordinary technological advancement and extraordinary corruption. But the physical aspects of the Nephilim were just as startling. The biblical accounts suggest beings of such immense size and strength that they dominated the ancient world. When Scripture says they became mighty men of renown, it's describing beings whose very presence inspired terror and awe. They were physical manifestations of spiritual rebellion against God's order. This explains why their emergence marked such a crucial turning point. Genesis tells us that after their appearance, God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. This wasn't just about human sin. This was about a fundamental corruption of creation itself. The Nephilim represented a direct challenge to God's authority and his created order. The implications were staggering. These beings didn't just threaten human civilization, they threatened the very bloodline through which God had promised the Messiah would come. If human DNA could be corrupted on a wide scale, the promise of salvation through a pure human descendant of Eve would be impossible to fulfill. This helps us understand why God's response had to be so dramatic. The flood wasn't just about punishing human wickedness, it was about preserving the possibility of human redemption. The emergence of the Nephilim had created an existential threat to God's plan of salvation. But here's where the story takes an even more remarkable turn. Despite the flood, despite God's intervention to cleanse the earth, we haven't seen the last of these beings. Their reappearance after the flood opens up even more profound questions we'll explore in our next chapter. The Great Flood stands as one of the most catastrophic events in biblical history. When we read Genesis chapter 6, verse 7, we hear God's devastating verdict. I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth. The corruption brought by the Nephilim had become so severe that only a complete reset of creation could address it. The floodwaters covered even the highest mountains, destroying all life except what was preserved in Noah's Ark. Logic would suggest this should have been the end of the Nephilim. After all, if these beings were destroyed along with everything else, how could they possibly return? The Bible tells us that only Noah's family survived. 8 people total, along with the animals God had chosen to preserve. Yet something extraordinary happens in the biblical narrative. Centuries after the flood, when Moses sends spies to scout the promised land, they return with a shocking report. In Numbers chapter 13, they describe encountering the descendants of Anak, giants who made them feel like grasshoppers in comparison. These weren't just tall people. The Hebrew text uses specific terms linking these beings to the pre-flood Nephilim. This raises a crucial question. If the flood destroyed all flesh except what was in the ark, how did these giants return? The answer may lie in an often overlooked detail of the post-flood narrative. After Noah's family left the ark, something troubling occurred. Ham, one of Noah's sons, committed an act so serious that it resulted in a curse being pronounced on his son Canaan. Interestingly, it's primarily in Canaan's territory that we later find these giant tribes, the Anakim, the Rephaim, the Emim. Could there be a connection between Ham's transgression and the re-emergence of these beings? The Bible doesn't explicitly tell us, but the geographical and genealogical patterns are striking. What we do know is that these post-flood giants weren't isolated cases. They formed entire tribes and nations. They built cities with massive walls and wielded weapons of extraordinary size. The bed of Og, king of Bashan, was over 13 feet long. Goliath, whom David would later face, stood nearly 10 feet tall. But there's something else we need to consider. The flood didn't just destroy physical beings, it was meant to cleanse the earth of a spiritual corruption. Yet Scripture tells us that spiritual beings, angels, both faithful and fallen, continued to interact with the physical world after the flood. Could this suggest that the spiritual forces behind the original Nephilim found new ways to manifest their corruption? This possibility becomes even more significant when we consider Jesus' words about the end times. He said that the days before his return would be like the days of Noah. Was he referring only to people's wickedness, or was he warning us about something more specific? A return to the conditions that allowed for the emergence of these beings in the first place. The reappearance of giants after the flood serves as a sobering reminder. Evil is persistent, and spiritual corruption seeks to reassert itself even after divine judgment. But it also reminds us of something crucial: God's power to preserve his people even in the face of seemingly insurmountable opposition. The flood may not have permanently erased the giants, but it demonstrated God's sovereignty over all creation, both physical and spiritual. The return of these beings sets the stage for some of the most dramatic confrontations in biblical history. When the Israelite spies entered Canaan to scout the promised land, they encountered something that shook them to their core. In Numbers chapter 13, they reported seeing the descendants of Anak, giants who made them feel insignificant by comparison. This wasn't just a case of encountering tall people. The Hebrew text specifically connects these beings to the ancient Nephilim, using language that echoes the pre-flood world. These weren't isolated sightings. The Bible describes entire regions inhabited by different tribes of giants. The Anakim dominated the hill country. The Rephaim controlled vast territories in Bashan. The Emim and Zamzumim held their own lands. These weren't wandering nomads. They had established kingdoms, built cities with enormous walls, and developed advanced weaponry. Consider the descriptions we find in Deuteronomy. Moses recounts how these beings had established sophisticated civilizations. Their cities were heavily fortified, with walls that, according to the biblical account, reached up to heaven. Their weapons and artifacts were scaled to their massive size. When archaeological discoveries in these regions uncover unusually large structures and implements, we begin to understand the scale of what the Israelites faced. But these giants weren't just physically imposing. Like their pre-flood predecessors, they represented a spiritual corruption. They practiced forms of worship that God had explicitly condemned. They possessed knowledge and technologies that seemed beyond normal human development. Their very presence in the Promised Land represented a direct challenge to God's plans for his people. The biblical narrative shows us something remarkable about these beings. Despite their tremendous physical advantages, they consistently fell before God's people when faith was present. Remember David and Goliath. This wasn't just a story about an underdog victory. It was a demonstration of how faith in God trumps even the most intimidating physical opposition. This pattern appears throughout Scripture. Joshua and Caleb, who trusted in God's promises, saw these giants differently than the other spies. Where others saw invincible enemies, they saw defeated foes. Their perspective wasn't based on physical reality, but on spiritual truth. They understood that no matter how tall these beings stood, they couldn't stand against the God of Israel. The territories of these giants became the scenes of some of Israel's greatest victories. King Og of Bashan, whose iron bed was over 13 feet long, fell before Israel's armies. The Anakim, who had terrified the first generation of spies, were driven out by Joshua's forces. One by one, these seemingly invincible beings were defeated. But here's what's crucial to understand. While these giants were defeated militarily, the spiritual forces behind them weren't completely eliminated. Just as they had found ways to re-emerge after the flood, these corrupting influences continued to manifest throughout history in different forms. This persistence points to something deeper than just physical beings. It suggests an ongoing spiritual battle that continues to this day. The return of the giants after the flood wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was a reminder that evil is persistent and adaptable. but it was also a demonstration that God's power and promises remain stronger than any opposition, no matter how formidable it might appear. As we move into our next chapter, we'll see how these beings became direct enemies of Israel and what their continued presence tells us about the nature of spiritual warfare throughout history. The battles between Israel and the giants weren't just military conflicts, they were spiritual confrontations that would shape the course of biblical history. One of the most vivid accounts comes from Deuteronomy chapter 3, where we learn about King Og of Bashan. His bed, made of iron, measured 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. Imagine encountering a ruler of such immense size, commanding an army from fortified cities. When the Israelites faced these beings in battle, they weren't just dealing with physically imposing enemies. These giants represented the last vestiges of a corrupted bloodline, occupying the very land God had promised to his people. Every confrontation was both physical and spiritual, a test of faith against seemingly impossible odds. The story of David and Goliath perfectly captures this dynamic. Goliath wasn't just a tall warrior, he was a champion of the Philistines who carried weapons and armor scaled to his massive size. His spearhead alone weighed 15 pounds. Each morning and evening, he would step forward to challenge Israel, not just mocking their army, but defying their God. David's response to Goliath reveals the true nature of these conflicts. While others saw an unbeatable foe, David saw an enemy defying the living God. His victory wasn't just about skill with a sling. It was about understanding that no giant, no matter how fearsome, could stand against divine power. The 5 smooth stones he chose represented complete confidence in God's promise, not uncertainty about the outcome. But Goliath wasn't alone. Scripture tells us he had brothers, equally massive warriors, who continued to battle Israel. In the books of Samuel and Chronicles, we read about more encounters with these giant champions. Each time, they fell before warriors who trusted in God's power rather than their own strength. The conquest of Canaan itself was largely a campaign against territories controlled by these beings. The Anakim had built cities with walls that seemed to touch the sky. The Rephaim held secure positions in mountainous regions. Yet time after time, these supposedly invincible enemies were defeated by Israel's armies when they moved in faith and obedience to God's commands. These battles teach us something profound about spiritual warfare. The giants' physical size represented spiritual opposition that seemed overwhelming. Their fortified cities symbolized strongholds of evil that appeared impenetrable. Their advanced weapons and tactics showed how the enemy often seems better equipped and more powerful than God's people. Yet in every case where Israel faced these giants in faith, victory was assured. When they doubted, like the first generation of spies, they saw themselves as grasshoppers. When they trusted God, like Joshua and Caleb, they saw the giants as bread to be consumed, already defeated enemies just waiting to fall. The biblical record of these battles isn't just ancient military history, it's a pattern that shows how spiritual opposition operates and how it's overcome. These giants used intimidation, superior technology, and psychological warfare, tactics still employed by spiritual enemies today, but they consistently fell before those who understood that the battle belonged to the Lord. As we've seen these giants appear in battle after battle, a pattern emerges. Their presence wasn't random. They seemed to concentrate in places of spiritual significance, often connected to ancient forms of worship and forbidden knowledge. This leads us to our next chapter, where we'll explore the mysterious connections between these giants, ancient civilizations, and knowledge that was never meant for human possession. The biblical account of giants intersects with a deeper mystery that spans ancient civilizations across the world. Every culture seems to preserve memories of beings who were more than human, entities that possessed knowledge and capabilities far beyond normal human understanding. The Bible gives us glimpses of this knowledge when it describes the world before the flood. a time when the boundaries between the divine and human realms had been breached. Genesis tells us that before the flood, wickedness had filled the earth, but ancient Jewish texts expand on this, suggesting that part of this corruption involved the teaching of forbidden knowledge. The giants weren't just physically imposing, they possessed understanding of metallurgy, warfare, cosmetics, sorcery, and astronomy that transformed the ancient world. This might explain why we find evidence of advanced ancient technology that seems out of place with conventional historical timelines. Consider the massive stone structures that still puzzle archaeologists today. From the precise astronomical alignments of ancient monuments to engineering feats that challenge modern understanding, we see evidence of knowledge that doesn't fit neatly into our picture of ancient capabilities. The Bible's account of giants provides a possible explanation for these anomalies. When Moses sent spies into Canaan, they found cities with walls that seemed to reach to heaven. Archaeological discoveries in these regions have uncovered massive stone blocks and architectural features that seem beyond the capabilities of ancient building methods. The biblical narrative suggests these weren't just advanced human civilizations. They were the works of beings who possessed knowledge from beyond our realm. This connects to a deeper pattern we see throughout Scripture. Wherever we find these giants, we also find centers of pagan worship and forbidden practices. The territories of the Rephaim, Anakim, and other giant tribes weren't just military strongholds, they were spiritual centers where ancient forms of wisdom were preserved and practiced. The implications are profound. The Bible isn't just telling us about physically large beings, it's revealing an ancient conflict over knowledge itself. When God commanded Israel to completely destroy these cities and their inhabitants, it wasn't just about conquering territory, it was about eliminating corrupted knowledge that was never meant for human possession. This might explain why so many ancient sites associated with giants also show evidence of sudden, violent destruction. The biblical flood account describes not just a water catastrophe, but a complete reshaping of Earth's surface, as if the very ground needed to be cleansed of corruption. Later, when Israel conquered Canaan, entire cities associated with giants were destroyed and burned. Yet traces of this knowledge persisted. The Bible records how forms of forbidden wisdom continued to reappear throughout history, often in the same regions where giants had once dwelled. This suggests that the influence of these beings extended beyond their physical presence, creating spiritual strongholds that would challenge God's people for generations. What's particularly striking is how these patterns connect to modern times. Today, we're seeing rapid advances in technology and knowledge that parallel aspects of what ancient texts describe. We're crossing boundaries between the natural and artificial, between human and machine, between physical and spiritual realms. The parallels to the time before the flood are difficult to ignore. This brings us to Jesus' prophetic warning about the end times being like the days of Noah. Was he just talking about moral corruption? Or was he warning about a repeat of that ancient violation of boundaries between the divine and human realms? As we move into our final chapter, we'll explore why this ancient history might be more relevant to our time than we ever imagined. Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 24 have taken on new meaning in our time. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. When he spoke these words, Jesus wasn't just making a general statement about wickedness, he was pointing to specific conditions that would mark the end times. Consider what characterized Noah's day. Beyond just moral corruption, it was a time when the boundaries between the divine and human realms were breached. It was a period marked by unprecedented changes to human nature itself. The Nephilim weren't just physical giants, they represented a fundamental corruption of God's created order. Now look at our world today. We're standing at the threshold of technologies that promise to reshape what it means to be human. Genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, transhumanism. These aren't just scientific advances. They represent attempts to transcend the limitations God placed on human nature. The parallels to Noah's time are striking. In laboratories around the world, scientists are mixing human and animal DNA, creating hybrid embryos and editing the human genome. We're developing artificial intelligence systems that seem to approach consciousness. We're even talking about merging human consciousness with machines. These developments mirror the ancient corruption that brought about the flood, the mixing of kinds that God had separated. But there's more to Jesus' warning. In Noah's time, the corruption was both physical and spiritual. The Nephilim brought not just physical changes but forbidden knowledge, ways of understanding and manipulating reality that humans were never meant to possess. Today, we're pushing into similar territory. Quantum computing promises to unlock the deepest secrets of reality. AI systems are developing capabilities that seem almost supernatural. The Bible tells us that before the flood, every imagination of man's heart was continuously evil. Today, we're seeing human imagination unleashed in unprecedented ways. We're not just changing our environment, we're reshaping the very essence of what it means to be human. This is exactly the kind of boundary crossing that characterized the days of Noah. Yet Jesus' warning isn't just about technology or knowledge. It's about spiritual preparedness. Noah's generation was caught unaware, carrying on with normal life until judgment came. Today, many Christians fail to recognize the spiritual significance of these developments. We're so focused on the amazing possibilities that we miss the prophetic warnings. The return of conditions similar to Noah's time doesn't necessarily mean we'll see physical giants walking the earth again. The corruption might take different forms, but the spiritual pattern remains the same. Humanity, reaching for knowledge and power beyond what God intended, crossing boundaries He established for our protection. This is why understanding the story of the Nephilim is crucial for our time. It's not just ancient history, it's a prophetic template that helps us recognize the signs Jesus warned about. The same spiritual forces that corrupted the world before the flood are still at work today, using new methods but pursuing the same goal, corrupting God's creation and defying His established order. But remember, Noah's story isn't just about judgment, it's about salvation. God provided a way of escape for those who remained faithful. As we see these ancient patterns recurring in our time, we're not called to fear, but to spiritual vigilance. Understanding these parallels helps us stay alert and faithful in increasingly challenging times. Throughout this journey, we've uncovered a story that stretches from the dawn of human history to our present moment. The Nephilim weren't just characters in an ancient tale. They were a warning sign, a reminder of what happens when the boundaries God established for humanity are crossed. What makes this particularly relevant today is how closely our world parallels the conditions Jesus described. The same spirit of boundary crossing that marked Noah's time is evident in our technological advances, our scientific pursuits, and our spiritual confusion. We're not just repeating history, we're fulfilling prophecy. But this understanding isn't meant to frighten us. It's meant to wake us up, to help us recognize the spiritual significance of our time. Just as Noah prepared for what was coming, we too need to be spiritually prepared. The giants we face today might not be physical beings, but the spiritual challenges are just as real. When you look at your own life, what boundaries are being challenged? Where do you see pressure to compromise what God has established? These are the modern-day giants we must confront, not with physical weapons, but with spiritual discernment and faith. The story of the Nephilim reminds us that no matter how powerful the opposition might seem, God's authority remains supreme. Just as He preserved Noah's family through the flood, just as He gave David victory over Goliath, He continues to protect and empower those who remain faithful to him. I encourage you to take what you've learned today and look deeper. Study these passages for yourself. Consider how they apply to our current world. Share these insights with others who might be struggling to make sense of our rapidly changing times. If this video has opened your eyes, don't stop here. Subscribe for more eye-opening biblical mysteries and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. Do you think the Nephilim are truly gone, or is there something we're still not seeing? Remember, understanding prophecy isn't just about knowing what's coming. It's about being prepared when it arrives.